Well, friends, we're going to be leaving the Asian continent and heading back towards Egypt and the Mediterranean. And I know that when we study one chapter and then the next and then the next, it kind of feels like we're going from the very oldest to something newer each time. And that's not the case. As we kind of studied Egypt, we studied a period from 3000 to 1000, and then we went to China and Japan and studied that same period. Um, but now we're headed back towards, let's say, north of Egypt. And if you go north of Egypt, you're going to be getting pretty wet. You're going to get into the Mediterranean. And in the Mediterranean are some islands, and some of those islands are volcanic in nature. And the mainland of Greece is more or less north of Egypt. And the time period that we're going to be studying is between 3000 BCE and 1000 BCE. So this is kind of like another bunch of civilizations that are happening in the world in a familiar time, which we've called the Bronze Age. Not the Stone Age, but the Bronze Age. And we talked about that in Egypt, the Middle East. We talked about it in India, China, and Japan. So now we're going into the Mediterranean, and we're going to be calling this the Aegean civilization, the ancient Aegean. And we're headed towards the classical period. And in the classical period, we're going to be looking at Greece in its ascendance, in its prime, which is about 500 AD. And we're going to be looking at Italy and Rome and the Roman Empire. That, if we were to be saying what's the most important thing in the Western art tradition that this class is going to cover, we would say it's going to be a 3-week period that we're just getting into right now. And it's called the classical period. And it runs from roughly 500 BC to about 400 or 500 AD. But before we study the mature classical period, we do want to set the stage and look at some of the people who were in the area. We know that the Greeks had boats, and we know the Italians and the Romans had boats. And a lot of those, the Egyptians, they traded with boats. And a lot of those boats were designed to be sailed within sight of land. They were not supposed to go out into the deep ocean, out into the middle of the Mediterranean. But the group of people that we're going to study now had a wonderful trading system, and they knew how to navigate. and they knew how to figure out that the shortest distance between 2 points might be right out there across open water and getting out of sight of land and being able to navigate and uh, conduct a robust trade with some of these civilizations that we've already talked about. So there's a back and forth, like we saw with the Silk Road. When you start doing trading, you pick up artistic techniques and things like that. So I guess that's one way to talk about a difference from some of these other cultures that did trading. Uh, some of those traders were just kind of being safe and just sailing along the shore and putting in at night and then going out the next day. Whereas the Aegean sailors were, they designed their boats to be uh, much more seaworthy. So in this circle, this kind of yellowish circle here, we're going to talk about the Cycladic, and these are the Cyclades and Thera, which is right here. Now, some of you may have heard about Mount Vesuvius during the time of the Roman Empire. It was a volcano that blew its top and covered up an entire village, Pompeii, with a terrible cost of lives. Archaeologically, it's a time capsule that allows modern day anthropologists to dig up the past, and it was like a moment frozen in time. Well, we'll find out that Thera was also one of those mountains that blew up and covered over an entire village. But luckily, all the residents had had time to, there were enough earthquakes, they had time to flee and get out of there. But the mountain reformed the whole island and covered everything with ash. It wasn't until 1960s that archaeologists got in to uncover this. So we have the Cyclades, and then we have this big island down here called Crete, and we're going to talk about Minoan culture. I just want to throw out the term non-military trading, and that's hard to believe, but the Minoans were kind of a friendly type of civilization, and they seem to be able to work out political agreements without going to war, and they were very good at trading with many countries around the Mediterranean. Now, a culture that was more warlike, and that's, I'm sad to say, but that's what we've been dealing with an awful lot, is once a civilization gets its feet on the ground, the next thing they want to do is expand. And that's what happened. The Mycenaean period, it grew from this mainland stronghold, and it expanded and took in this whole area by the time it was done. So the book will talk about each one of these three Mediterranean civilizations, and they'll talk about almost identical time periods. So there's uh, all sorts of interactions that are happening on one place or another place, and sometimes they all come together. Um, if you've taken your ARH 102, you would think that this is a Brancusi sculpture. This Brancusi was working in the 1950s and making very beautiful marble abstract sculptures. But if you notice down here, it says the Cyclades, and we're talking about 2500 BCE. I think of the Egyptians just because of the symmetry in it, but also the book is going to give you an interactive which will show you that there was a canon, a set of proportions used to draw these figures from the Cyclades, and it's 3 circles. And if you are a person who likes to draw, I invite you to get out your compass and draw these 3 circles and then fill it in. And you'll notice that there are some big differences between uh, Egypt and the Middle East and the Cyclades. Uh, marble shows up here, and marble is mined on the mainland of Greece and ended up in the Cyclades, and they were sculpting very abstract heads, but they painted them in certain ways that were symbolic and significant. It's believed that the Persians had given the Aegeans the idea of a potter's wheel, and the ceramics in all of these different civilizations in the Mediterranean, they were great potters, robust designs on these, and high quality ceramics. So this is down on Crete, and there's an old palace and there's a new palace, period. And they say they roughly approximate the old and the new kingdom in Egypt. Now, what's missing here is fortification. We know that many of the early civilizations built walls around their uh, governing buildings. You'll notice up here that we have a throne room, but I guess you could say the weather's so nice that what happened was people like to do everything in the central court here. So if you think about a nice place, kind of like a temperate, a very mild climate, and the designers opened this structure up so that there were breezes that were blowing through, and the engineering had figured out ways of building waterways and water pipes and sewer pipes, and it was a very advanced type of thing. So here's just a look at one of the light wells, and they have a very distinct column that the book will talk about. The bottom part is wood, and it's kind of like an upside down tree trunk, and then this very big pillow-like capital on top of it. Um, this is a fresco of, some people call it bull jumping or bull leaping, and you'll have to listen to the interactive video about this. There are a couple of different theories about what's happening. The light, whiter figures are female. The browner one is male. And you've seen in Persia, you've seen the bull being used as a very strong symbol. In India, the bull is used. So this civilization really, really liked the strength of the bull. And I don't know if this is where bullfighting started, but I don't think there was any sort of execution of the animal. I think the animal was worshipped. So beautiful color, beautiful pattern all the way around it. The height is approximately 24 inches. So it looks like it's a fairly large painting. What caught my attention about this statue is that it said that it was, the legs were made out of the tusk of, I'm not sure it was some sort of ivory. I think it was a marine ivory. And they carved it to such a degree that they even put in the pattern of the veins in the legs. Now this one has been through a fire, so it looks a little rough, but it had a gold skirt on it at one time, and it was similar to that figure that was leaping over the top of the bull. So very, very much attention to detail. These are rhytons, and they're a form of religious vials that hold liquid, and during religious ceremonies they would pour the liquids out of the bottles. But again, your interactive text, and I'm really enjoying REVEL. It's got some neat animated features, and it has some nice videos. They will talk about the humanity that's shown in this. This is not just a bunch of stick figures or patterned stylistic people. These are people who have facial expressions, and they look like they're probably going harvesting, and they're either singing or chanting. So hats off to the Aegeans for bringing in human emotion into their work. Here is another rhyton that has an opening in the back to put liquids into it. And then at certain times during the ceremony, you would tip it forward and the liquids would come out of the mouth of the bull. And this had, when they discovered it, the horns were not in good shape, but they realized that the horns were made from wood and then they were coated with gold. So again, there's a tremendous amount of realism in the handling of the hair on the fur on this bull. Uh, this is some 1500 to 1450. It's a little bit later, and you'll notice that being a seafaring civilization, they loved animals. And here you have the octopus with all of the patterning, real strong negative and positive space. And they filled it all in with little kelp and sea creatures. A flask. Um, from the Middle East, from the Persians, they caught on real quick to working not only bronze, they did a lot of bronze work, but also gold and jewelry. And this is a double wasp sort of pendant uh, with just wonderful detail in it. That caged ball up on top is pretty tricky. This is repoussé work, and I'm going to try and find a video to show you how it's done. I took a jewelry making class, and they gave us each something that looked like a half of a bowling ball. And the innards of the bowling ball had been filled up with tar. And it was hard, but what you did was you took a sheet of metal and you put it on top of the cold tar, and you took certain kinds of uh, rounded tools and you would beat on the back side. You would shape the pieces of metal to form figures. This is a bull here. And to make the shoulder of the bull, you would work from the inside and you would pound and you would make this bulge out. And then later on, you would take the piece and turn it over, and then you'd use scrapers and sanding and filing, and you would refine the forms. So repoussé is a pretty interesting form of jewelry making, but here it's being used in a very small cup made out of gold. So Thera was the island, and the town that got covered in ash, but luckily nobody was there, was Akrotira. And Akrotira is a time capsule of Minoan art. Beautiful wall paintings, and this is supposedly one of the first landscapes that anybody in the ancient world ever did. Normally, you would have people in a landscape, but here they just drew the landscape. Here is a young lady who is probably participating in a rite of passage into womanhood. You can read about that in the text. And this is a flotilla from Akrotira, a wall painting. It's line by line. It's really analyzed for you in REVEL, so I'm not going to go into it. But it's not a military mission. This is more of a celebration or more of a story of people who are traitors. Now, when we go to the mainland, all of a sudden we get fortifications. So this is the Mycenaean period, and we have a wall that's amazingly, I think it was like 25 feet thick and 30 to 40 feet tall. And it's called a citadel. It's not called a palace because it's kind of like a village and a government complex that's defensible against attack. Right here, you'll see the term Lion Gate, and you're going to see a picture of this in just a second. But this is the entranceway. If you wanted to enter into this walled city, you would have to go through the Lion's Gate, and then you would be going up the ramp towards the palace. And remember this name, the Megaron, it's going to be a pretty fancy looking thing. So those are some features that, and archaeologists always like to discover the cemetery. So here's the grave circle where they dug up some interesting tombs. I'm underlining in the caption here Heinrich Schliemann. And Schliemann was a good archaeologist and a very bad archaeologist. A good archaeologist discovers things, and Schliemann discovered things. A bad archaeologist discovers things and then jumps to conclusions about what they are, and they don't listen to the scientific evidence. And Schliemann was just obsessed with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he wanted to discover Troy, which he did, and then he wanted to discover where Agamemnon came from. And so he went into the Aegean and he discovered this Mycenaean palace, and he jumped to the conclusion that it was Agamemnon's palace, and even excavated some graves and came up with a mask of Agamemnon. Later on, people figured out that he was off by quite a few years, and so what he claimed for being true wasn't. I pointed out the Megaron. So the Megaron in Minoan, we had a courtyard, an open place where people did government. Here you have a closed place, and you have a throne room. This is kind of like where the king would sit and proclaim judgment, and there was a open fire pit here, and beautiful, beautiful painting in all sorts of geometric and bright colors. Seems to me like a very, it reminds me of Egyptian, but I think it's got a different flavor to it. This is in quotation marks because we figured out that this may even be a forgery, or it may have been restored. There's even one or two scholars who say Schliemann had the mask made in Germany, and he actually had it made to look something like himself. And then he declared it the mask of Agamemnon, and he contacted the Greeks, and they put it in a museum. So maybe Schliemann is pulling one over on us. Once we get past the high point of Greece with a building called the Parthenon, we're going to get into Rome, and we're going to hear about another building, which is the Pantheon. And what's so amazing about the Pantheon is that it doesn't have a whole bunch of internal support to enclose the space. You guys remember the Hypostyle Hall in the Temple of Nefertiti's? It was like a forest of columns just to hold the roof up, and it wasn't clear and unobstructed space. Well, this grave site, or so-called treasury, is, and it does have some burial chambers in the side of it. But if you were to walk into this hillside here, it's an artificial hill. You would come up, you would enter this room, and there's no columns. There's nothing to impede your sight lines or your motion. And you would look up above you, and it would be like archways, all kinds of arches, one arch after another arch after another arch, and all of those arches come together at the top, and you have a vault. You have an open space. So sometimes this is called a beehive tomb, and it's something way past what the Egyptians would be capable of doing. It's a new type of architecture. Here is the entranceway as you walk up, and of course at the time this would be a big door, a vault, and you just couldn't walk right in because it had been sealed up. But it has been opened up, and here you can see what it would be like in the human scale. The height is approximately 43 feet. And if you've ever been in a neighborhood that had telephone poles, telephone pole is about 30 feet tall. So you could put a telephone pole in here and it would not even reach the top. So that's quite a tall area. This is the latter. This is the Mycenaean period, and to go along with those fortified walls, and you're not talking about the peace-loving trader anymore. You have a woman way over here on the side, and she is waving or bemoaning the fact that a whole brigade of foot soldiers are leaving, and of course we never know how many of those foot soldiers are going to come back. So these are not cute little octopus. These are not little dolphins jumping around. This is getting a little bit later, 1300 to 1100 BCE. And from the mainland of Greece, the Mycenaean period, you're going to see this more martial approach to living in the world.